Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Trump, Israel, and Regional Backlash, Understanding Americanism in the Middle East. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. I'm Evangeline, a research associate at MEI. Right now at Singapore, it's 3 o'clock. I believe at Cairo, it is 10 a.m., bright and cheery in the morning. To start off, I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Mustapha Al-Sayyid is a professor of political science at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University. He is a leading political scientist with decades of experience teaching at Cairo University and the American University in Cairo. He earned his PhD from the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva and has held visiting positions at UCLA, Harvard Law School, and Colgate University. He has published widely on political economy, human rights, and civil society, and led the team behind the 2009 Arab Human Development Report and founded the think tank Partners in Development for Research, Consulting, and Training. He also pioneered courses on the politics of human rights in Egypt. Actively engaged in public debates, he contributes columns to Al Shuruk newspaper and provides expert commentary to BBC Arabic and other international media outlets. We have also another guest here. He is Professor Mazen Hassan. Professor Hassan is a professor of comparative politics at Cairo University, where his research focuses on political economy, social norms, and electoral behavior in the Middle East. A graduate of Oxford and Warwick, he has held visiting positions at Harvard, Oxford, MIT, Hamburg, and the American University in Cairo. His work has appeared in democratization, government and opposition, and political studies, among others. Professor Hassan will offer his take following Professor Mustafa's presentation. Before I hand over the floor to Professor Mustafa, I must say that this webinar could not be more timely. Just 2 days ago, Donald Trump convened the Peace 2025 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. 8 months on, the plan has taken a surprising turn from its original revealer of the Middle East proposal. So right now, nobody will be forced to leave Gaza, and Israel would seemingly fully withdraw without annexing territory. So I'm just believe that these are sticking points that will require difficult and possible long talks even in these few days. And for Arab friends in the Middle East, how will this affect this sense of anti-Americanism along the Arab street? So I just find this webinar so very timely. And then as we go along, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. So as you listen along, please feel free to share your thoughts on the Q&A box, and if you have questions for specific speakers, it'd be good to write down their names as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Mustafa, who will unpack these dynamics and what they reveal about the future of US-Arab relations. Right now, I want to hand over the floor to Professor Mustafa right now. Thank you, Professor Mustafa.
Webinar. I must say also that this is not my first time with the National University of Singapore. I was at the university many years ago with the late Professor Michael Hudson of Georgetown University, and we were engaged also in a debate about the Middle East. I would like to start by presenting my outline. I'll define anti-Americanism and I'll explain the context in which it has been manifested and how it has changed over time. Then I'll talk about the specific features of anti-Americanism in Arab relations. And I'll define who is anti-American in the Arab world. Are the anti-Americans to be found among the rulers or among the people? Which political trends, which social classes take a position hostile to the US. And I'll offer some ideas about the situation at present using public opinion polls carried out by the Arab Barometer, which is conducted at the Princeton University. And I'll offer the interpretations of anti-Americanism in Arab countries. And I'll explain the extent to which anti-Americanism influences Arab countries' relations with the US. What is anti-Americanism? Very broadly, we could say that anti-Americanism is expressing a negative attitude towards the US, expressing, I don't know, critical attitude towards the US in general. However, there are varieties of anti-Americanism. There is what I call radical anti-Americanism, which means rejecting everything American, everything. I don't know the type of American way of life, relations among different ethnic groups, American movies, American music, American media, and of course, American political system and American foreign policy. This is the radical anti-Americanism. However, there is, moderate anti-Americanism, which is, could be limited to certain policies of the US or certain aspects of the US, let us say, I don't know, economic system, policies on globalization, etc. And then finally, there is the narrowly focused anti-Americanism, which is, focused on specific aspects of US policy. And I would like, to say that the anti-Americanism in the Arab world belongs mostly to the third type, which is narrowly focused on US foreign policy. Anti-Americanism in the Arab world does not go to areas like the American way of life, the American music, American movies, American fast food chains. In fact, quite the contrary. Whereas the Arabs could be critical of US foreign policy, they admire American fast food chains. They like American movies. And in fact, the number of Arabs who like to go and migrate and live in the United States is great. So I think we have to see that anti-Americanism in the Arab world is limited mostly to US foreign policy, and particularly US foreign policy towards the Palestinians. But this does not mean that the Arabs would take a negative attitude towards, the American way of life. In fact, I am critical of the American way of life, but I don't know, many people in Arab countries admire the American way of life as, it is projected to them through American media. Now, in general, if we look at anti-Americanism worldwide, we'll find that, it has been manifested in different regions of the world. Anti-Americanism is not limited to the Arab world. Anti-Americanism was expressed in Europe in the 1960s when the US was, involved in fighting the National Liberation Front in Vietnam and had, 500,000,000 soldiers fighting the Vietnamese in the south and in the north. This gave rise to anti-war movement, which was general in university campuses in France, in Germany, in the United Kingdom. So, but I think this European expression of anti-Americanism waned later on after the end of the war in Vietnam, although we would find, certain writings which are critical of certain aspects of the American way of life. Despite the fact that long time ago, a French prince, in fact, wrote a famous book, Democracy in America, admiring the US. So, the attitude towards the US is not, stable over time. It does change over time. In Latin America, of course, Latin anti-Americanism was manifested in the 1960s and in the 1970s because the US was heavily involved against, guerrilla movements. Of course, was hostile to the Cuban regime under Castro, was hostile to what Che Guevara was trying to do by creating another Vietnam in Latin America. US also was known to have been behind the military coup d'etat, which overthrew freely elected governments in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Chile in 1973. So, anti-Americanism is very, very strong in Latin America and perhaps still strong now. In Arab countries, it has been manifested I think since the particularly in the 1960s, maybe less so in the 1950s, because in the 1950s, still, Arabs had a favorable view of the US to the extent that the radical regime, like the July regime in Egypt, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser in the beginning, tried to promote good relations with the US. But I think the US replacing, old imperial powers in the Middle East and, coming strongly in the 1960s behind Israel led to the rise of anti-Americanism in the Arab world. But it went, as I will explain, anti-Americanism in the Arab world went through waves. So I'll point out later that at the beginning of the Biden administration, Arab views, and I'm relying here on the Arab barometer, were quite favorable to the US. But of course, this was, after the first term of President Trump, during which views of the US were very, very negative in the Arab world. So, it goes up and goes down. So it is not, stable over time. Now, what are the specific features of anti-Americanism in Arab countries? First of all, it is a common attitude. We'll find, anti-Americanism expressed in most countries of the Middle East. I think, in all countries of the Middle East, there could be, few exceptions. I think Morocco stands as an exception, but even in countries which have close relations with the US, the view of the US was negative, even in countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc. The view of the US was quite negative. So it is a general attitude in Arab countries. But as I said before, it is related mostly to US foreign policy. So, we do not see, people who are critical of the US, talk about the US political system, although even professional political scientists, American political scientist Samuel Huntington was very critical of the US political system. But anti-Americanism in the Arab world is limited mostly to US foreign policy, particularly towards Israel, and recently towards, Islamists, towards the promotion of democracy in the region. So it is a general attitude, but as I said, it goes up and down, and it is limited mostly to the US foreign policy. Now, occasionally, anti-Americanism is combined with violent behavior. And of course, the most famous case is that of the events of September 11, when, I don't know, young Arabs led US airliners to attack the World Trade Center and the Defense Department. And all of them, this is very interesting, all of them came from Gulf countries, which had the best relations, officially, the best relations with the US, and apparently they were led by an Egyptian. So these, the hijackers of planes in September 11, came from the countries which had the closest relations with the US. And interestingly, also, all of them were, of middle class background. I mean, they were not poor, uneducated Arabs. No, they were very well educated. They came from wealthy families. And of course, presumably, they were inspired by Osama bin Laden, who belongs to perhaps the second wealthiest family in Saudi Arabia. So this is very important because, some people associate anti-Americanism with the envy of the power and wealth and prosperity of the US. However, those who, not only were critical of the US, but who engaged in a very violent action were coming from, families who do not suffer starvation, poverty, misery, etc. They were very, very well-to-do people, and they come from, the wealthiest families in their countries. And there were other occasions when this anti-Americanism was combined with violent behavior. The attack on the US embassy in Beirut in 1982, in which, I don't know, over 80 Marines were protecting the embassy, were killed, and attack on the U.S. in soldiers in Somalia, attacks on U.S. embassies in Kenya and in Tanzania. So, anti-Americanism was manifested in violent behavior. But in general, it is just an attitude which could be, found in articles in newspapers, commentaries on the media. Um, and also, I would like to say also in novels, there is, some Arab novelists had the opportunity to spend time in the US, and they wrote very critically about the US. One of them is Radwa Ashur, the late Radwa Ashur, who is married to a Palestinian, and also she wrote her memoirs of the period she spent in the US, and she was very critical. The same thing with, a very well-known Egyptian novelist, Sonallah Ibrahim, who wrote Americanelli, in which also he, in fact, offered a balanced view of the US, but also he talked about racial discrimination in the U.S. I would like to add that recently, anti-Americanism in the Arab world is associated with certain features of American politics. This question of freedom of sexual orientation, I think, and treating people with different sexual orientations, equally. I think this is not seen well, not only in Arab countries but also in some African countries. Another feature of this, attitude towards the US is that it is persistent over time. It started perhaps in the 1960s, and it continues until the present time now. Who is anti-American in the Arab world? I think in a book written by Professor Amani Jamal, who is now the dean or the director of the School of Public Affairs at the University of Princeton, and who runs the Arab Barometer. I borrow some of her ideas, but I add myself that among governments, this she does not say. We can make a distinction between Republican nationalists, Republican regimes who are led by Arab nationalists vis-a-vis conservative monarchies. It is mostly, I think, at the official level, those who express critical attitudes of the US were mostly the so-called radical regimes in the Arab world in the 1960s. In the 1960s, we used to talk about Arab Cold War, which put radical regimes against conservative monarchies. Radical regimes were calling for Arab unity, were against colonialism, and were adopting foreign policies, non-aligned foreign policies, but also they had close relations with the Soviet Union, and they tended also to enlarge the role of the state in the economy, and some of them would call themselves socialists. So I think these were the first to express, among governments, these were the first to express anti-Americanism. However, these regimes have disappeared. There is, I think it is very difficult to identify one regime as Arab nationalist now in the Arab world. The countries were led by those militant nationalists are now in the hands of people who favor good relations with the United States. But historically, anti-Americanism among governments was associated with Republican regimes led by militant Arab nationalists, whereas the conservative monarchies, particularly in the Gulf and in Morocco and in Jordan, maintained always very good relations with the US. Among political movements, this is easy to identify. the political movements or the ideological trends which are critical of the US. Of course, Arab nationalists, because they consider the US is, acting against, Arab unity. The US was, sympathetic to those who overthrew the United Arab Republic in 1961. Then the leftists also, because they are critical of the US capitalism, and they are also, historically, they maintained good relations with the socialist countries. Then, interestingly, also liberals, we find anti-Americanism among liberals. Why? Because, they would accuse the US of being supportive of dictatorships in the Arab world. So, dictatorships in the Arab world, for the liberals, they believe, in fact, there are books which, accuse the CIA of being behind the July 1952 action by the army in Egypt, which you call the July Revolution. So there are books which accuse the US, not just the US government, but the CIA to be behind the coup which overthrew the monarchy and brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power. And recently also, the liberals are critical of the US because they believe that the US is supporting Islamists. So when the Egyptian people revolted against the rule by the Muslim Brothers in 2013, and then, President Sisi came in and, of course, established the military regime. However, the liberals, in fact, accused the US of being behind the Islamists because, the US, I think, my understanding is that the US, could not know what to do when the Islamists won the election in 2012. Of course, there are many views of what happened in the elections of 2012, but anyway, it seemed that the the Muslim Brothers had the majority in elections, and therefore they formed the government. And the US government under Obama was very critical of the President Sisi's regime, which was seen as a militarist regime. So for this reason, in fact, there are articles and large sections of public opinion in Arab countries, particularly in Egypt, believe that the US is supporting the Islamists. Of course, the Islamists who fled the Arab countries found refuge in Western countries, particularly in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and there are many of their sympathizers in the US. And I think until now, according to my knowledge, the US Congress did not consider the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. It is considered a terrorist organization by the present government in Egypt. So there is this view among liberals that the US, in fact, was behind the rise of the Islamists in Arab countries, particularly in Egypt. Of course, the US, had good relations with the so-called Islamist government in Turkey. So they think that the US position on Islamists in Egypt is the same as its position towards the Islamists in Turkey. So these are the major trends which take a stand against the US and which express this narrowly focused kind of anti-Americanism among citizens. Also, it is Amani Jamal who claims that in fact, within the elite in the socio-economic sense, those people who are prosperous, upper middle class people, they tend to view the US more favorably than the masses. I think her view is, to a certain extent, is quite close to reality. Those people who upper middle class people in Arab countries in general, not just in Egypt, view the US favorably. and like very much that the US that their countries would maintain good relations with the US. Within the masses, it's very difficult to know, but I think within the masses they associate the US with massive support for Israel. However, these ideological commitments does not mean those who are critical of the US to try to maintain good relations with the US. So even President Gamal Abdel Nasser was critical of the US, who did not support the building of the High Dam in 1956. In the 1960s, under the administration of President John Kennedy, he tried to promote good relations with the US. So Saddam Hussein was critical of the US, maintained good relations with the US at the time of the Iran-Iraq war. So we should not assume that ideological commitment to anti-Americanism would prevent governments in particular from seeking for practical reasons good relations with the US. Now, the situation at present, the Arab barometer, the Arab barometer, conducts waves of public opinion polls in Arab countries, but I think the latest poll was 2022, was published in 2023. So I don't have, the most recent data on public opinion polls in Arab countries. However, it is very interesting that according to Arab Barometer, I said, which is conducted, at the University of Princeton and led by Amani Jamal, it is very interesting that it notes that anti-Americanism also went through ups and downs. So it went up during the first administration of President Trump. The attitudes were very, very negative, but they improved at the beginning of the administration of President Biden. And comparing the US to China, later on, I think the Arabs found there were more favorable views towards China than towards the US. So those countries who had more favorable view of the US included, Morocco, followed by Libya. In these two countries, the favorable views of the US exceeds 50%. So it is 60% in Morocco, about 50% in Libya. This was years ago. And then, it goes down to, 18%, 38% in Tunisia, 36% in Jordan, 35% in Iraq, and in Algeria, 31%, in Lebanon, 27%. That wave did not include Gulf countries. So we see, different, two types, countries who had favorable views of the US, like Morocco and Libya, and then, other countries who had unfavorable views. I guess in the case of Morocco, this could be explained by the fact that the US takes the side of Morocco against Algeria. In Libya, because the US played an active role in overthrowing Muammar al-Gaddafi. Comparing Trump to Biden, in fact, at the beginning of the Biden administration, the favorable views of the US improved very much, or, so this it was about 47% of those of the interviewees in Libya. It was about 46% in Morocco. Then it was less than 50% in Tunisia, Iraq, Jordan, Algeria, and Lebanon. In fact, the negative view was the highest. I mean, the most negative view was in Lebanon, followed by Algeria, Jordan. It's very interesting that, Jordan maintains good relations with the US. However, the view in Jordan was quite critical of the US, even under the administration of President Biden. It was also quite negative in Iraq and in Tunisia. So these were the favorable views of the US. But however, when we go to the first term of President Trump, the favorable views of the US were really minority in all countries. So the favorable views went down to 18% in Lebanon, to 15% in Morocco, to 12% in Algeria, to 10% in Libya, to 7% in Jordan, and to 6% in Tunisia. So we see that, the vast majority of Arabs under President Trump had, of course, I'm generalizing, but anyway, the vast majority of those who were interviewed by the Arab Barometer had negative views of the US under President Trump, the first administration of President Trump. As far as foreign policy of Trump is concerned, the view was very, very negative. In fact, those who judged the foreign policy of Trump to be good, those who said that it was very good were only 2%. 2%. Those who saw it was good were only 4%. And those who thought that it was bad were 17%. Those who thought it was very bad was, 66%. And yeah, okay. So this is, the views of US under two administrations, and we see that there has been, big shift when, President Trump, came to the White House, and the situation improved to a certain extent under President Trump. Of course, under President Biden. However, these these were conducted before the events of October 7, 2023. However, normalization of relations with the between the some Arab countries and Israel, between United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. This was viewed also quite negatively in Arab countries, in Lebanon, in Morocco, even in Morocco, only 9% of the people. 9% of the people in Morocco, which had normalized relations with the US, only 9% of the interviewees supported this. And this goes down to 9% in Algeria, 8% in Tunisia, 7% in Libya, 3% in Jordan. Of course, we know Jordan, a good almost half of the Jordanians are Palestinians, and the Jordanian people in general, is quite sympathetic with the Palestinians. The highest percentage of those who accepted normalization between Israel and the United States, between Israel and Arab countries, were in Lebanon, about 20%. So even in Lebanon, only 20% of the people, I think, supported normalization of relations between Israel and certain Arab countries. Now, when we compare the US and China, we find that in general, views of China are more favorable than those of the US. So those who found, the image of China to be quite positive, were over 15% in Algeria, in Morocco, in Libya, in Tunisia, and Iraq, and were less than 50% in Lebanon and Jordan. But the best, most favorable attitude, most favorable image of China was to be found in Algeria, where 65% of the interviewees found it to be quite positive, followed by Morocco, about 62%, then Libya and Tunisia. So I think yeah, so this is in fact what I have, the most recent polls that I found tell us about the attitude of public opinion in Arab countries towards the US. Now, how do we interpret, anti-Americanism in the Arab countries? There are, several interpretations. One of them, considers that anti-Americanism is, an expression of rejection by, certain sections of the Arab people of U.S. civilization. So the U.S. way of life, U.S. political system, ethnic relations in the U.S., U.S. movies, U.S. music, everything in the U.S., U.S. as a civilization is rejected. And, I guess this would be probably, among the Islamists. I mean, certain Islamists would reject completely the type of civilization that the US represents. The US civilization is seen to be materialistic, individualistic, allowing, sexual freedom, etc., and oppressive of minorities, particularly Muslims, etc. So this is, one interpretation. Another interpretation is that it is expression of envy. The U.S. is wealthy. Americans are prosperous, live very well. So I don't like this interpretation. But anyway, this is one interpretation. In fact, was promoted by an American political scientist of Lebanese origin, who was my friend, the late Fuad Ajami, who considered that the anti-Americanism in the Arab world is an expression of envy. The Arabs envy US for its military power, economic, influence, stability of the political system, prosperity, etc. But anyway, this is, one interpretation. A third interpretation is that it is a rational objection. Rational objection of U.S. policies towards Arab countries. It has nothing to do with the U.S. civilization or with the envy of the U.S. Well-to-do Arabs considers, and I think rightly so, that the U.S. Has been, I think, particularly in recent years. Of course, there are certain situations in which the U.S. Opposed Israel. In 1956, President Eisenhower exerted pressure on Israel to evacuate Sinai Peninsula. Also, President Bush, the father, George Bush, the father, exerted pressure on Israel to stop the building of settlements. Even President Clinton tried to promote President Carter tried to promote, peace settlements in Arab countries, particularly between Egypt and Israel. Clinton pursued the same path, did not succeed, but anyway, recently, I think, particularly since the last 2 years of President Biden, and definitely President Trump, the last 2 years of President Biden and President Trump at present, complete support for Israel, and we don't have to be hostile to U.S. civilization or envious towards U.S. prosperity, but we can see U.S. behavior in the UN Security Council. 14 countries call for ceasefire in Gaza, but then the American representative exercises his veto power the arms that the Israelis are using in Gaza, are, coming from the US. The US under Trump recognized Jerusalem against UN resolutions to be the capital of Israel, recognized Golan to be part of Israel. And recently also, the Trump administration was about to recognize the West Bank as, recognize the annexation of the West Bank as part of Israel. So, I mean, this is my view. I am critical of U.S. foreign policy because, it takes a stand which is completely, supportive of Israel, despite the fact that the international community, not just, international public opinion, but, most governments, are taking a critical stand towards actions by Israel. And in fact, this was seen in the speech that President Trump pronounced in Sharm el-Sheikh. He talked only about, Israeli hostages. What about, the misery in Gaza? What about the Palestinians? Not one word. He did not mention the Palestinians one word in his speech. So I don't know. This is really an expression of the one-sidedness of U.S. policy towards the Middle East. There is also one interpretation which could be found in, books and articles in the U.S. that, in fact, anti-Americanism in the Arab world is manipulated by unpopular regimes. So, in fact, it is inspired by the ruling regimes in Arab countries, ruling regimes who are unpopular, but they seek popularity by, inciting or encouraging, articles in newspapers, programs on the TV, which are critical of the US. So, they would say, well, the Egyptian government, is unpopular, but it tries to enhance its popularity by encouraging the expression of anti-Americanism in Egyptian newspapers and in Egyptian media. And you find, this view is not just echoed, but it is, explicitly expressed in some writings in the US. Now, despite all this, there is a disconnect between popular attitudes and Arab governments' foreign policies. I would say that, most Arab governments now, despite attitudes of their people, try to promote good relations with the US. I do not see, one single exception. Maybe Dr. Mazen will, mention one exception, but, all over the Arab world, from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, to Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, all Arab governments, try to promote good relations with the US. So, there is a disconnect between popular attitudes. There is no doubt that, Arabs in general are very critical of the US foreign policy. I mean, they are very critical of the US foreign policy, but they don't attack Americans. There are no attacks on American embassies, American institutions. Arab people, the number of Arabs who like to migrate to the US or to get education for their kids in US universities is huge. All over the Arab world, even in a country like Algeria, or Tunisia. Myself, I have seen, Tunisians and Algerians, studying in US universities, and their families are happy about this. So, in fact, it is, anti-Americanism in the Arab world is really narrowly focused on US foreign policy, but not US foreign policy in general, US foreign policy towards, mostly towards the Palestinians or towards the Arab world. But, no one is critical of, maybe I mean, among the intellectuals and the experts, I could be critical of US policy towards China or US policy towards, Russia and Ukraine. But, this is a matter to be a concern for the experts. But, among the people, I think negative attitudes towards the US are limited to US policies towards Arab countries. And I hope I did not exceed, no, I did exceed the 30 minutes you allowed me, but, I'm known to be a talkative professor. So, okay, all right, I stop here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor Hassan and Professor Mustafa. That was so power packed. In fact, there's so much that we could talk about because there's very limited time. But I'm just also very curious. Will you say that anti-Americanism is largely an outgrowth of anti-Israel sentiment, or it could just stand on its own? Another question I could have for Dr. Hassan. I mean, what you said just now was really very interesting about being politically correct, and yet people are queuing up to, perhaps migrate or immigrate to the US. So is this a very bifurcated view in perhaps not just in Egypt, but in uh, the Gulf, in Levant as well? So maybe any one of you can answer right now.
Okay, if you would allow me to answer this question, to what extent the anti-American attitude is exclusively limited to U.S. policy towards Israel? No, I think it goes beyond Israel. U.S. did not support the building of the High Dam in Egypt in 1956. U.S. Is viewed to be supportive of Islamists. U.S. is viewed to be, supportive of dictatorships in the Arab world. So it is not, whereas the Palestinian issue is a major component of this negative attitude towards the U.S., but it is not the only element. There are, other elements, and I think the US is viewed to be supportive of Islamists. I think, I did examine the record of Obama administration, and I think the views within the Obama administration were quite divided, whether to support the Islamists or to support other groups. But anyway, the attitude of public opinion and the media promotes this notion that the US is supportive of Islamists. So in fact, there are more issues to be, invoked when we talk about anti-Americanism in the Arab world, and it's not only U.S. Attitude towards Israel, although this is the most important.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafa, and maybe Dr. Hassan, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a natural outcome that you get in many surveys in the Arab world that trace public opinion, which is these seemingly contradictory views. I can give you many, many examples, and also particularly to anti-Americanism. So the Arab Barometer survey has even more evidence about this, which is that although, as Professor Al-Sayyid said, usually most Arab publics basically favor China more than they favor the US. But when they are asked about strengthening economic relations with either country, they actually favor stronger economic ties with the US as opposed to China. Which again is, I think, an extension of the view I have said with regard to it is politically correct to have, less favorable views of the US, but when it comes to bread and butter issues, when it comes to livelihoods, when it comes to economic issues, you tend to favor the economic superpower of the world. Just another point, again, reflecting on what Dr. Al-Sayyid said, in countries that have very, very strong ties with the US, which are Gulf countries, sometimes speaking with citizens of GCC countries, they have even more anti-American attitudes politically than Egyptians, for example. Although they are, or many of them are literally militarily protected by the US. So they owe it to the US, basically, that they can defend their own territories. So yes, these contradictions, the ambivalence, we see, especially when it comes to anti-American attitudes.
I wish that again I could go on because we are nearly 4 o'clock. I just want to thank Dr. Mustapha and Dr. Hassan for sharing the valuable insights. And what I walk away from today is honestly what we see on the news, what we hear on X, on social media might just be a veneer or facade of everything that is going on behind the back. And at the end of the day, it seems that even though there could be signs of anti-Americanism happening day after day, and we see it being highlighted across the world today. I mean, how it also reaches this part of the world. I think that is great to see that a lot of people out there are honestly realist. They are pragmatic people and they know what to do with their own lives. So I just want to thank Dr. Mustapha and Dr. Hassan again for really contributing the insights. And I really enjoyed listening to the breakdown of the Arab barometer about how the people in Lebanon, how the people in Jordan feel about the US. So and I want to thank all the audience who are here. Thank you for your patience, for being here with us for 1 hour, and we hope to see you in future MEI events. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.